Thank you very much, and thank you very much to QED for inviting the EBA to present one of the key mandates the EBA has to develop under the PSD2. Strong customer authentication and common and open and secure communication is the name of this mandate. It's quite a mouthful, but it's quite important because it already sets the scene for what the EBA has been mandated to do. The RTS that we've published for consultation 6 weeks ago is quite extensive, it's quite detailed, and we really look forward to receiving your responses if you're considering responding. Can I actually just ask a show of hands? Who is intending to respond to that consultation? Not maybe personally, but the organization that you represent. No, that's not too many. Okay, it's maybe 2/3 and half. Okay. I have a bet internally at the EBA. We have, I mentioned this earlier in the round, at the moment there's a record number of responses at the EBA, which is 128, which we received when we consulted on remuneration requirements for bankers. So that was very popular. Lots of people affected and had their views. And the discussion paper on strong customer authentication that we issued a year ago just failed to break that record. We had 116, I think. And I just hope that the number of responses to the consultation paper now breaks that record, so I can internally at the EBA go around and show off a little bit. So please, those of you who haven't raised your hand, please consider responding. I don't mean it as a joke. This RTS is rather complex. I said when we had the public hearing at the EBA 2 weeks ago, we expect quite some concerns by the industry. We don't have the expectation to make everyone happy with the RTS, and you will not all be happy once we have delivered the final RTS. We have a more modest aspiration, and that is to make everyone equally unhappy, because there are very different views amongst external stakeholders about what this RTS should contain. But allow me to give first an overview of what the EBA is, just 2 slides, and then the remaining 8 or 9 slides are characterizing the RTS. And then, of course, we can enter then the discussion with our panelists and with you about what it should, where it should be changed or where it should be retained. I just realized I don't have, do I? Where is it? All right, thank you. Sorry for that. So, let's make it work. So, introduction of the EBA, just 3 slides, and then the remaining slides about the RTS itself. So, EBA, we came into being in 2011. We were established in 2011 after the financial crisis in order to prevent future financial crisis. We took over a couple of responsibilities of a predecessor committee that didn't have any legally binding effect, which is the Committee of European Banking Supervisors. We took on their responsibilities, but we received additional mandates in the area of consumer protection, financial innovation, and payments. We are an independent authority. We are accountable to the European Union Parliament and the EU Council. And as our highest governing body, we have the 28 national authorities, the heads, the executive directors of the 28 national authorities in the EU member states, and they agree or do not agree on what is published as a legally binding requirement in the EU. And as a result, all of the output of the EBA, including all the mandates under the PSD2 that we have to develop, have been developed with those 28 national authorities. So we are not a centralist institution, but we develop this with our 28 national member authorities. Sorry. What's also very important for you to be aware, the EBA doesn't operate just where it thinks it would like to operate, where it has identified issues, but it has a so-called scope of action, which sets the limit of the financial services sectors and subsectors that the EBA can become active in, and that scope of action is defined by the EU directives and the EU regulations that have been assigned to the EBA. And you see some of them here, Capital Requirements Directive, Deposit Guarantee Scheme Directive, and so on. And then further down in the middle, the directives that are probably more known to you, such as Payment Service Directive 1 and 2, Electronic Money Directive, Anti-Money Laundering Directive, Payment Accounts Directive, and so on. So in these areas, we can become active. We can become active in various ways. This is an overview of all the so-called legal instruments that the EBA has issued. Particularly the first 2 or 3 rows is what you need to focus on. You can ignore the other ones. technical standards. There are two types. I don't explain the difference. It's a bit too technical and legalistic. And guidelines. Because the EBA under the PSD2 has been mandated to develop 11 legal instruments, 6 technical standards, and 5 sets of guidelines. Technical standards are directly applicable union law. So once the EBA has developed them, submitted them to the Commission, and the Commission has done its legal review to check whether the EBA has stayed within the legal mandate given to it in the level 1 text, and is then adopted, then it becomes directly applicable union law. So there is no national transposition. There is no national implementation by a national regulator, by a national government. The Commission publishes it in the official journal with an application date, which in most cases is January 2018, and then it becomes law. This is different from guidelines, and there are 5 sets of guidelines that the EBA is developing under the PSD2. Guidelines the EBA issues, they are not subject to an adoption process by the Commission, and also not subject to a scrutiny by the Parliament and Council. And once the EBA has issued them, the national authorities have to implement these guidelines into their national regulatory framework. So the legally binding effect arises through that national implementation. And guidelines, therefore, unlike what the name would suggest, are legally binding. However, the name guidelines is quite appropriate because there is a particular proviso for guidelines, which is that national authorities have the option not to comply with the guidelines. So all the national authorities have to indicate and notify us whether they comply with guidelines. And if they don't, they have to provide explanation, and we will start engaging in a discussion with them, a robust discussion on why they're not complying. And this is made public as well. So we have compliance tables for all of our guidelines, and we have issued nearly 50, probably around 55 or 60 by now. And everyone has a compliance table. There are very few guidelines where national authorities or individual national authorities do not comply, primarily because we are developing them together with them. But sometimes there are national legal constraints that don't allow a national authority to actually implement them, or implement them through or by the timeline that is imposed. And also, a difference between technical standards and guidelines is technical standards the EBA cannot issue out of its own initiative. We can only issue technical standards when the legislators, the Commission and the co-legislators, Parliament and Council, have mandated us to do so. Because we are basically writing law, and we are, as legislators, we are not elected, so we cannot issue them out of our own initiative. Guidelines, however, we can develop out of our own initiative. So let's now come to the PSD2 before we go into the actual RTS on strong customer authentication. So there are a total of 11 mandates. I'm just going to build up this slide one by one. At the moment, you only see some vertical lines to give you some timelines. So the timeline at the bottom. The PSD2 entered into force in January this year. It will apply from January 2018, and in the meantime, there are various mandates that the EBA has to develop, and they either have to be done within 12 months of entry into force by January 2017, or within 18 months, and others are due within 24 months, with the exception of strong customer authentication, which has a very different timeline and is somewhat unique, and that is the bottom row that you will see in a second. So, first set of technical standards are related to the coordination of supervision. So this is about passporting, when payment institutions want to passport cross borders. It's about the supervision, cross-border supervision of payment institutions, as well as central contact points. So various RTSs have to be developed by the EBA to various timelines. Then we have, in the area of consumer protection, we have to develop guidelines on complaints procedures. This is complaints procedures that apply to national authorities, so how they have to handle complaints. Then in the area of authorization, we have guidelines on the authorization of payment institutions, as well as, crucially, guidelines on the professional indemnity insurance for payment initiation and account information service providers. So the PSD2 provides that those of you who would like to provide those services and are not already a credit institution, i.e. don't already have liability insurance of one kind or another, you will have to take out professional indemnity insurance. And we have to set guidelines on how the cover, insurance cover, is going to be calculated. Then we have to develop a register, a European register of all payment institutions in the European Union. And various mandates in the area of security. So we have to develop guidelines on incident reporting, guidelines on security measures, and an RTS on strong customer authentication, which is the one that we're going to be talking about today. All of these three mandates the EBA is developing jointly with the ECB as provided in the PSD2. Now on that strong customer authentication, RTS, the timeline is slightly different. All of these RTSs that you see, they all apply from January 2018 onwards, with the exception of that one. Here the timeline is different, so we are to develop the RTS and submit to the Commission the RTS by January 2017, so there are another 4 or 5 months left. Then the Commission will check whether we stayed within our legal mandate. The European Council and the Parliament have a scrutiny right in that process, not only for this RTS but for the others as well. As a result, it's very difficult to predict how long it will take the Commission as well as the Council and the Parliament to conclude this process. But it is fair to assume that it will take a minimum of 3 months. Probably a good expectation would be maybe 5 or 6 months, but it's not for the EBA to be able to predict or influence this process. Once the Commission has adopted that RTS and published in the journal, so the PSD2 provides, another 18 months will pass until that RTS starts to apply. So if you calculate all of that together, that means that the earliest application date of this RTS is October 2018. When it will be exactly, we will only know once it's published in the journal, because then the countdown starts ticking and then there's another 18 months to go. So it's a bit specific. We don't have any other directives, and we had to develop lots of technical standards that have that sort of provision. We'll have to see how we'll have to deal with it. There are going to be quite some, or there are already now, quite some questions on what exactly is going to happen between January 2018, when the PSD2 applies, and that later application date of this RTS for us as regulators, as supervisors, exactly what we're going to do in this intervening period. But we are not dealing with that at the moment internally, and I'm not presenting about that either, because at the moment we are looking more at the substance of the RTS itself. So just to give you an overview, what we have done so far. So this is where we are today, October 2016. We have published a consultation paper on passporting notifications and are probably 1 or 2 months away to publish the final RTS. We have just 2 weeks ago published another consultation paper on professional indemnity insurance in the middle. So some of you, can I just another raise of hands, please? Which one of you is potentially intending to provide account information or payment initiation services in this room? Could you raise your hand? 1, 2, obviously support already on the case, so 4. Okay, that's not too many. So, but those 4, you may want to have a close look at this consultation paper, because it may be of interest to you as well. And then we had a discussion paper and consultation paper on the strong customer authentication RTS. And for all of you to be aware that there will be 3 more consultation papers coming over the next 3 or 4 months on the complaints procedures, on authorization, and on incident reporting. When exactly, not quite clear yet, but it will all happen over the next 3 or 4 months. Okay, let's now come to the RTS and strong customer authentication. And unfortunately, the next 4 or 5 slides will be a bit, there will be lots of text on the slides, because we need to make reference to, for example, the mandate itself. So this first slide is just for you to make you aware, and for those of you who have already read the consultation paper, you will hopefully be aware of the mandate as has been conferred on the EBA, because a given for the EBA is that this is the mandate and we cannot change it. So every word that is written in the PSD2 with regard to what the EBA is supposed to do, and this is a quote from the PSD2, we will have to fulfill. Even if there are maybe some areas where we think the language could be more precise, or is maybe a little bit inconsistent with some other provisions elsewhere in the PSD2, this is what we have to do. This is what we have to deliver. What's also clear, so let's just go through some of these provisions. The requirements of strong customer authentication when the payer accesses his payment account online, initiates an electronic payment transaction, or carries out any action through a remote channel which may imply a risk of payment fraud or other abuses. So that's already the scope of the RTS, which is not for us to change. That is to what transactions the RTS applies, as provided in the PSD2. Then the exemptions to this RTS, to the security requirements. And to be clear, these are exemptions. So I had already some conversations on previous occasions that some people think we can just generally leave it to market actors to decide themselves what security measures they would like to take. That is not the mandate. We cannot do this. And I'm not quite sure even if we could do this legally, whether we would do this. But this also sets the scope. Then the requirements with which security measures have to comply in order to protect the confidentiality and integrity of the payment service users' personalized security credentials. And then crucially, the common and open and secure communication standards with which the new entrants, the providers of account information services and payment initiation services will interact with incumbent banks, which in the PSD2 are referred to as account servicing payment service providers, ASPSPs. So this is the mandate, and that's a given. So there is no scope for us to change anything. But of course, some of the wording required some clarification. So we had the European Commission help us to identify and to clarify some of the wording as we were developing this over the last 12 months. Let's go through the 4 chapters. So I want to make very explicit some of the understandings that the EBA has with regard to this RTS. So we have to deliver a mandate by the deadline of January 2011, develop security requirements that are not only an enhancement for existing payment services, but also facilitate the orderly functioning of the new services that are introduced through PSD2 and mitigate the specific risks. So that's one of the challenges that the EBA is facing. Then we need to find appropriate trade-offs between various competing demands. The PSD2 has various objectives that this RTS and all the other mandates that the EBA has to develop has to facilitate. For example, on the one hand, we want a high degree of security and authentication, but that would then suggest a high degree of intrusion into the payment transaction process. But on the other hand, we would want to allow a high degree of customer convenience, which would suggest a minimum intrusion into the payment transaction process, particularly for many of the innovative solutions that are being developed. So where exactly is that trade-off that the EBA has to achieve is one of the challenges that we've been facing and that we continue to face over the next 4 months as we will review the hopefully thousands of pages that we will be getting in consultation responses. On the other hand, another challenge is a high degree of security and authentication, and then very detailed technological requirements against the competing demand of us wanting to ensure that innovation can happen. So we want to facilitate innovation. The timeline that I explained earlier, the fact that we are now developing an RTS and will be submitting it by January 2017 to the Commission, but actually only comes into effect 18 months later, at the very earliest, October 2018. That already is a time lag of at least 18 months. Lots of innovation can happen in that process. So how do we develop an RTS that takes account at least flexibility for this innovation to happen? But also beyond 2018 once the RTS is developed. So that would suggest that we actually should stay we shouldn't go into too much technical detail, but we should stay at a higher level in order to allow for that innovation to be developed, to be gathering ground. So we found a particular compromise that you have seen in the RTS, and we are keen to hear from you whether you think we found the right compromise. And the third one is a high degree of common communication. This is now about the communication interface. So about that communication, how detailed are we going to be in that respect? On the one hand, you could think that we are going to be very prescriptive on how that communication is going to work, because only then will we ensure that one of the objectives of the PSD2 to create a European market for payment systems is actually fulfilled, because there will be only very few standards that are going to be working, that are going to be used, industry standards that are going to be used by the industry that are all compliant with the RTS of the EBA. But then the more detailed we go, the less innovation, again, we will allow for industry to develop different industry solutions, different industry standards. So if we stay at a high level, though, we have a risk of fragmentation in the European Union, that lots of different industry standards start to be developed and actually undermining one of the objectives of the PSD2. So here again, we have found a particular compromise and we are keen to hear in your consultation responses, of which there are hopefully many, what your views are, whether we got this right. And then the final thing, which is what I already alluded to before, we have to develop the RTS in the confines of the mandate. We cannot change definition in the PSD2. We cannot change the mandate. We have to develop what's written in the mandate. So what the CP does is it states certain understandings, how we interpret the mandate, given the mandate itself, the formulation, as well as various other provisions that are associated with it. For you to understand what our starting point is, but also to let us know what you think about the interpretation. Whether we will be able to change anything, we will have to see, but we are keen to hear your views anyway. So, first chapter is about the strong customer authentication procedure. One of the understandings is that strong customer authentication shall apply to electronic payments initiated by the payer, such as credit transfers or card payments, but does not apply to electronic payments initiated by the PE only. That's one of the understandings. Another one relates to the fact that the SCA procedure will remain fully in the sphere of the bank, of the account servicing payment service providers, ASPSP, and to the right-hand side. A third one is that card acquiring payment service providers should require payees to support strong customer authentication. So that is also within the scope of the mandate. With regard to the exemptions, there are exemptions, so we have to specify the cases where SCA is does not need to be applied. There is still an unresolved issue whether these exemptions are supposed to be mandatory. So once we have defined the exemptions, you have to apply the exemptions or not. So we have, again, exposed our understanding. We are keen to hear market views. We will finalize our view with the help of the Commission over the next months, and then hopefully come to a solution that is doable. Again, the expectation level is we are not going to make everyone happy. We want to make you all equally unhappy. And in chapter 3, it's about protecting user credentials. This may probably be not too controversial, but we are keen to hear what industry's views are. So you are required to implement measures to protect the creation, association with payment service users, delivery, renewal, and destruction of the credentials. That's what the RTS covers. It should guarantee the confidentiality, as well as the delivery and possession by the intended payment service user. And then the standards of communication, or rather secure, open, and common communication. That is what we have to develop. Particular principles apply. Each ASPSP shall offer at least one communication interface, dedicated or not, enabling secure communication with the with the account information service provider and payment initiation service provider. The ASPSPs, i.e. the banks, shall ensure that the communication interface allow the third-party providers to rely on the authentication procedures provided by the bank to the payment service user. And the bank shall ensure that the communication interface uses common and open standards which are developed at an international or European level. And finally, the bank shall ensure that the communication interface is offering the same functionalities and the same level of availability, including support as the online platform made available to the payment service user when directly accessing the services. And if that is not the case, the PSD2 already provides, that's not said in our RTS because the PSD2 already says it, the third-party provider can rely on the current way how to access the payment account with a bank. So these are the 4 chapters that are covered. This is an overview. Of course, the consultation paper goes into much more detail. Allow me to just sketch what's going to happen next, the next steps. So we will be delivering this technical standards in January. Commission will review it. Council and Parliament have scrutiny rights. This will take 3 months at a minimum, more realistically 6 months, but it's difficult to estimate. Then it will be published in the official journal at that moment, and then it will enter into force 20 days later. And that moment, the 18 months countdown runs before the RTS applies, so October 2018 onwards. In terms of the development of the RTS, this consultation paper and your response is the final opportunity for you to shape our views. Any consultation by the EBA is not just a tick box exercise, so it will be every response will be looked at, every sentence will be looked at. And we also publish, when we publish our final RTS, what's referred to as a feedback table. So adjacent to the RTS, we will develop a feedback table where all of the major comments that we've received is listed. Our assessment is presented, whether we think this is a valid comment that therefore should lead to a change in the RTS compared to what we consulted on or not, and provides reasoning why we have accepted the request for a change or why we haven't, or why we agree or don't agree. So it will be all very transparent. And these consultation papers, they are really important. So this is really your opportunity, the opportunity for you to influence it. And I really hope to hear many responses from you. And with that, I conclude.